What if justice wasn't blind? What if the color of your skin determined whether you walked free or were locked away forever? This is the story of one man's fight against a system rigged to crush him, and the twist of fate that changed everything. Before we get down to business, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments, what is your name and from which city are you watching us? Your support is very important to us. We will be grateful if you like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for participating with us in this important project. Marcus had always been a cautious driver. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and the dim glow of the streetlights reflected off the hood of his old but reliable sedan. He had just finished another exhausting shift at the factory, and all he wanted was to get home, have a quick meal, and collapse into bed. The streets were nearly empty, and he drove carefully, keeping within the speed limit. As Marcus approached an intersection, the blinding headlights of a speeding SUV came barreling toward him. He barely had time to react before the SUV slammed into the side of his car with a deafening crunch. The impact sent his car spinning, smashing into a lamppost on the corner. The airbags deployed, the acrid smell of burned rubber filled the air, and Marcus's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his ears ringing from the collision. For a moment, everything was still. Marcus sat in shock, his breathing shallow. He scanned his body quickly, no broken bones, no blood. Thank God. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the door open, stepping out to assess the damage. The SUV's door flew open, and out stumbled the driver, a tall, middle-aged white man in a tailored suit. His face was flushed, and his steps were unsteady. Marcus immediately noticed the strong smell of alcohol emanating from him. It didn't take much to figure out that this man was drunk. "You idiot! Do you have any idea who you just crashed into?" the man roared, staggering toward Marcus. Marcus stayed calm, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Sir, you hit me. You came out of nowhere. Are you okay?" But the man wasn't listening. "Don't talk to me like that. You people don't know how to drive. Look what you did to my car." Marcus looked over at the SUV, a gleaming black luxury vehicle with minimal damage compared to his crumpled sedan. From the passenger seat, a woman who appeared to be the man's wife sat frozen, clutching her purse. In the back seat, a teenage boy stared out the window, his face pale and nervous. "Sir," Marcus said firmly, trying to stay composed despite his growing frustration, "you're drunk, and you ran into me. You need to calm down." The man's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Don't you dare tell me what I need to do," he shouted, jabbing a finger into Marcus's chest. "Do you even have insurance? Do you even belong in this neighborhood?" Marcus clenched his fists but held his tongue. This wasn't the first time he'd been spoken to like this, and he knew better than to escalate the situation. Meanwhile, a small crowd of onlookers began to gather on the sidewalk, murmuring among themselves. Someone pulled out their phone and dialed 911. Minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car lit up the scene. Marcus exhaled in relief, thinking that finally, things would be set right. But as the officers stepped out of their car, his relief turned to dread. The two officers barely glanced at the wreckage or the crowd. Instead, their eyes locked onto Marcus. The taller officer, with a hand already on his holster, barked, "Step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where we can see them." "Officer, I was the one hit," Marcus began, but the officer cut him off. "We'll figure that out later. Hands on the hood, now." Marcus froze. "But..." "Now," the officer yelled, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus complied, placing his hands on the hood of his car as one officer roughly patted him down. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the drunk driver standing to the side, casually lighting a cigar as if nothing had happened. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered under his breath. "What was that?" the officer snapped, spinning Marcus around. "Resisting, huh? Add that to the list." Marcus's heart pounded. I'm not resisting. I'm just trying to explain what happened. But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers slapped handcuffs onto his wrists and shoved him into the back of the squad car. As Marcus sat in the back seat, helplessly watching the scene unfold, the drunk driver sauntered over to one of the officers. They exchanged a few hushed words and a handshake. Marcus's stomach sank. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. The officer who had arrested him leaned into the squad car window, his face twisted in disdain. "You're under arrest for reckless driving, disturbing the peace, and endangerment," he said. Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. "But I didn't do anything wrong." "Tell it to the judge," the officer sneered before slamming the door shut. As the squad car pulled away, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the scene, the drunk driver laughing with his family, the SUV being towed away, and the crowd dispersing, their expressions a mix of pity and helplessness. For Marcus, this was no longer just a car accident. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Chapter 2, Arrested Without Question, detailed. The ride to the police station was a blur of flashing lights and deafening silence. Marcus sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. Every bump in the road sent a sharp jab of pain into his shoulder where the seatbelt had slammed into him during the crash. He stared out the window, his mind racing. How had this happened? He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, treated like a criminal while the drunk driver walked free. When they arrived at the station, the officers dragged Marcus out of the car and marched him inside without so much as a word. The fluorescent lights of the booking area buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the tired faces of the officers milling about. "Name?" the officer behind the desk asked, barely looking up as he flipped through some papers. "Marcus Daniels," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his throat. The officer smirked, finally glancing up at him. "Reckless driving, huh? That's not surprising." Marcus bit his tongue. He wanted to scream, to demand that they look at the evidence, talk to witnesses, or even just listen to his side of the story. But he knew better. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this situation could spiral even further out of control. The officers processed him with cold efficiency, fingerprints, mugshot, personal belongings dumped into a plastic bag. Marcus could feel the judgment radiating from every officer in the room. None of them asked for his version of events. None of them seemed to care. "Put him in holding," one of the officers barked. The taller officer from earlier grabbed Marcus by the arm and led him down a dimly lit hallway. They passed several cells, each filled with men in various states of despair. Some sat silently, heads bowed, while others paced back and forth like caged animals. The officer opened an empty cell and shoved Marcus inside. "Get comfortable," he sneered before slamming the door shut. Marcus sat down on the cold, hard bench, the reality of his situation sinking in. His thoughts were a chaotic mix of anger, confusion, and fear. How could this be happening? How could the system be so blatantly unjust? Through the bars, he overheard a conversation between two officers at the end of the hallway. "That guy in the suit, the one from the accident, he's a big deal, huh?" one officer said. "Big deal is an understatement," the other replied with a low whistle. "You didn't hear it from me, but he's connected. Real estate tycoon or something. Pays well to keep his problems handled." Marcus's stomach churned. Of course. The man who hit him wasn't just drunk, he was rich and powerful. Powerful enough to make his problems disappear, with money, no less. And Marcus, a factory worker with no connections and no influence, was the perfect scapegoat. Hours passed, but it felt like days. The cold of the cell seeped into Marcus's bones, and the distant hum of police chatter only deepened his sense of isolation. Occasionally, another officer would pass by, casting him a dismissive glance or muttering under their breath. At one point, a young officer approached the cell, carrying a clipboard. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone was finally here to listen, to hear the truth. "You're Marcus Daniels, right?" the officer asked, his tone clipped. "Yes," Marcus replied quickly. "Please, I need to tell you what happened. That man, he was drunk. He hit me. There were witnesses, they can confirm." The officer cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Save it for the judge," he said, scribbling something on his clipboard before walking away. Marcus sank back onto the bench, the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. It was clear that no one here cared about the truth. To them, he was just another black man in trouble with the law, a convenient target to close the case and collect their payday from the real culprit. As night fell, Marcus tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. The sound of distant shouting and the clanging of metal doors echoed through the station. He thought about his mother, who was probably worried sick when he didn't come home. He thought about his boss, who would undoubtedly fire him if he didn't show up for work tomorrow. And he thought about the man who had walked away from the crash without a care in the world, free to go home to his family while Marcus sat in a jail cell for a crime he didn't commit. The only thing keeping Marcus going was the faint hope that someone, anyone, would believe him. He didn't know how, but he vowed to fight this. He had to. Because if he didn't, who else would? Little did Marcus know, the wheels of injustice had already been set in motion, and the battle ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined. Chapter 3: A Rigged System. The next morning, Marcus was jolted awake by the grating sound of a metal batten raking against the bars of his cell. "Wake up, Daniels. Court's in an hour," the officer growled. Marcus sat up, his muscles stiff from a night spent on the unforgiving bench. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the crash and the injustice that followed. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support. The officer unlocked the cell, cuffed Marcus again, and let him out. The other inmates watched silently as Marcus was escorted down the dim corridor, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and resignation. They knew the look of a man about to face a system designed to crush him. When Marcus arrived at the courthouse, he was shoved into a small room to wait. His court-appointed lawyer, a young, disheveled man named Greg Saunders, walked in with a stack of papers under his arm. Greg looked exhausted, as if he had been assigned too many cases and cared too little about any of them. "All right, Marcus," Greg began without making eye contact, "you're being charged with reckless driving, property damage, and resisting arrest." Marcus's mouth dropped open. "Resisting arrest? Are you serious? I didn't resist anything. And reckless driving? The other guy hit me. He was drunk." Greg sighed and finally looked at Marcus. "Listen, I get it. But the other driver is claiming you swerved into his lane. And there are no breathalyzer results on file for him." Marcus stared at Greg in disbelief. "Of course there aren't. The cops didn't even check him. They just threw me in cuffs because I'm black, and he's some rich, white guy with connections." "Did you even talk to the witnesses?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Witnesses? Yes. There were people who saw what happened." Marcus leaned forward, his voice rising. "Did you even look into it?" Greg held up a hand, as if to calm him down. "Marcus, you have to understand how these things work. You're going up against someone with resources, someone who can make problems go away with a single phone call. The police already wrote up the report, and guess what? It paints you as the aggressor. This is an uphill battle." Marcus clenched his fists. "So, what are you saying? That I should just take the blame for something I didn't do?" Greg hesitated before replying. "No, but, if you plead guilty, I might be able to negotiate a lighter sentence. Maybe probation instead of jail time." "Plead guilty?" Marcus's voice was barely more than a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong." Greg shrugged. "Sometimes it's not about what's right. It's about what's easier." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened, and an officer motioned for them to head into the courtroom. The courtroom was intimidating, with its high ceilings, wooden benches, and the judge's imposing seat at the front. Marcus was led to the defendant's table, where he sat stiffly beside Greg. Across the room, the other driver sat comfortably, dressed in an expensive suit. His wife and teenage son were seated behind him, whispering to each other as if they were at a family outing instead of a courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman with an air of confidence, stood and began presenting the case. Her words dripped with bias as she painted Marcus as a reckless driver who had caused the accident and then resisted the officer's attempts to bring him under control. Marcus could feel the weight of the stares from the jury. Most of them were white, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they had already made up their minds. Greg stood to give his defense, but his argument was weak and unconvincing. He stumbled over his words and failed to challenge the prosecutor's narrative effectively. Marcus watched in despair, realizing that his lawyer wasn't fighting for him, he was just going through the motions. Then came the testimony of the other driver. The man stood and delivered a polished, rehearsed account of the crash, claiming that Marcus had been aggressive and erratic on the road. His wife nodded along, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a tissue as if she had been traumatized by the event. The prosecutor concluded her case with a flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just about a car accident. This is about accountability. The defendant's reckless actions endangered lives, and he must face the consequences." Marcus's heart sank. The system was rigged, and he was trapped in its web. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, something unexpected happened. The judge paused, looking down at the defendant's table with furrowed brows. His gaze lingered on Marcus. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said slowly, his tone shifting from detached authority to something more personal. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I don't think so, Your Honor." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "I remember now. You were the man who donated a kidney to save my daughter's life. Is that correct?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, sir." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the prosecutor, then at the other driver. The courtroom was silent as the weight of the revelation hung in the air. After a long pause, the judge spoke. "I'd like to review the details of this case more thoroughly. Court is adjourned for now. We will reconvene in 2 days." The gavel came down with a loud crack, and Marcus was led out of the courtroom. For the first time since the crash, he felt a glimmer of hope. The judge had recognized him, and that recognition might be enough to turn the tide. But Marcus also knew that this was far from over. The system had shown its colors, and he would have to fight tooth and nail for the justice he deserved. Chapter 4: A Second Chance. 2 days later, the courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation. Marcus sat quietly at the defendant's table, his heart pounding as he glanced at the judge. The memory of the judge's daughter, frail, clinging to life in the hospital, was etched into his mind. Marcus hadn't thought much about the lives he'd touched as a donor. Now, it seemed that act of kindness might be the only thing standing between him and a wrongful conviction. The judge entered, his face calm but serious. He banged the gavel and addressed the court. "Before we proceed, I've reviewed additional evidence and statements from this case. I have also requested a further investigation into the events of the crash." Everyone sat in stunned silence. The prosecutor exchanged a worried glance with the other driver. Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The judge turned toward the prosecutor. "Ms. Wallace, can you explain why the police report lacks breathalyzer results for Mr. Simmons, the other driver?" The prosecutor fumbled for a response. "Your Honor, it appears the officers on the scene deemed it unnecessary." The judge's voice sharpened. "Unnecessary? A witness report indicates that Mr. Simmons smelled strongly of alcohol at the time of the crash. Why was this overlooked? Marcus straightened in his chair. Finally, someone was asking the right questions. The judge continued, "Furthermore, I've reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby traffic camera. It clearly shows Mr. Simmons running a red light before colliding with Mr. Daniels' vehicle." Gasps filled the courtroom. The prosecutor's face paled, and the other driver shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said, turning to Marcus, "I see no evidence supporting the charges against you. This court owes you an apology for the injustice you've endured." Relief washed over Marcus, but the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Simmons," he said, addressing the other driver, "you will be charged with reckless driving, driving under the influence, and perjury. Bailiffs, take him into custody." The room erupted in murmurs as officers cuffed the now panicked Simmons. Marcus sat frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden shift. The judge banged his gavel once more. "This case is dismissed. Mr. Daniels, you are free to go. And let me say this, you've reminded me that character is more important than circumstance. Thank you for the life you saved." As Marcus left the courtroom, his head held high, the weight of the past few days began to lift. But he knew this wasn't just his victory, it was a step toward exposing a system that needed to change. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support. Chapter 5, The Fight Isn't Over. Marcus walked out of the courtroom a free man, but his victory was bittersweet. Outside, reporters swarmed him, asking how he felt. His answer was resolute. "This isn't just about me. How many others have been silenced, ignored, or punished because of the color of their skin? This system is broken, and we can't stop fighting until it's fixed." Weeks later, Marcus's story became a rallying cry. Protests erupted, demanding accountability from law enforcement and fairness in the justice system. Charles's conviction wasn't just a win for Marcus, it was a crack in the armor of systemic racism. But Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. As he stood before a crowd at a rally, he raised his fist high. "We fight, not just for justice, but for a world where dignity is our birthright, not a privilege we have to earn." The crowd roared, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus smiled. His story wasn't just his own anymore, it was a symbol of hope for all those still fighting for their voice to be heard. What happened to Marcus could happen to anyone. But his courage turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change.